The Krillian Academy stood like a monument to galactic superiority, its obsidian towers piercing the crimson sky of Nexus Prime. For 3,000 years, it had churned out the finest military minds in known space. Generals, admirals, and warlords from 17 different species had walked these halls, each one a testament to advanced civilization and tactical excellence. The Academy's motto, carved in quantum steel above the main entrance, proclaimed boldly, "Only the evolved may lead." So naturally, when the first primitive human was scheduled to arrive as an exchange student, the entire institution collectively lost its metaphorical minds. Commander Zeth Cole, a 7-foot-tall Krillian with skin like polished granite and 4 arms that had strangled more enemies than most species had fingers, he stood at attention in the receiving bay. His usually stoic expression showed the faintest hint of what his species called diplomatic disgust. That special look reserved for having to shake hands with something that still used projectile weapons. "Remind me again why we agreed to this?" he muttered to his aide, Lieutenant Keek Snell, whose tentacles were twitching with barely contained amusement. The Galactic Council insisted, "Sir, something about cultural exchange and broadening perspectives. Though between you and me, I think they just wanted to see what would happen when we put a primitive in with our top-tier cadets." The transport vessel landed with all the grace of a drunken Beatarian, which should have been the first warning sign. The airlock hissed open, and out stepped Well. Calling it a disappointment would have been generous. Jake Thompson, Crocodile to his mates, though none of the aliens understood the reference, stood barely 6 feet tall, which was practically microscopic by Academy standards. His hair was an unremarkable brown, styled in what could charitably be called deliberately messy. He wore the standard-issue Academy uniform, but somehow managed to make it look like he'd slept in it. Twice. But it was his face that really sent the Krillian cadets into fits of barely suppressed laughter. Jake Thompson was grinning. Not the predatory smile of a warrior, not the calculated expression of a tactician, but an actual, genuine, ear-to-ear grin that suggested either complete ignorance of his situation or a disturbing level of mental instability. "G-Day, mate," Jake called out, apparently addressing the entire assembled welcoming committee of the galaxy's most elite military academy like they were old drinking buddies. "Beautiful place you've got here. Reminds me of my uncle's cattle station, except with more, He gestured vaguely at the floating platforms and energy barriers. "Science Y bits." Commander Zeth Cole's eye twitched. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a being who described advanced gravitational technology as science Y-bits. Cadet Vrak Tar, a muscular Theronian whose species had evolved from apex predators, leaned over to his study partner, a crystalline Zephyrian named Clixandra. Is it trying to communicate with us?" he whispered, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the human could hear. "I think it's malfunctioning," Clixandra replied, her form shimmering with what her species used to indicate amusement. Perhaps the journey through hyperspace damaged its primitive neural pathways. Jake, apparently oblivious to the insults, pulled out a small container from his pack and began spreading something brown and viscous onto what appeared to be compressed plant matter. The smell that emanated from this concoction hit the assembled aliens like a psychic assault. "Anyone fancy a Vegemite sandwich?" he offered cheerfully, holding up his creation like it was some sort of peace offering. "Made it fresh this morning." "Well, fresh-ish. Time dilation's a real pain when you're trying to keep your tucker from going off." The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for funeral services or the moment before orbital bombardment. General Mordun, the Academy's chief instructor whose battle scars formed a roadmap of galactic conflicts, stepped forward. His species, the warlike Grimkari, communicated primarily through intimidation and controlled violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 conquered worlds. "Human," he rumbled, the word dripping with disdain. "You stand in the most prestigious military academy in known space. These cadets represent the pinnacle of evolutionary development. They have trained their entire lives for the honor of admission. And you bring food." Jake looked down at his sandwich, then back up at the general, his expression one of genuine confusion. Well, yeah, mate. Can't fight on an empty stomach, can you? Besides, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. My gran always said, your grandmother, General Moore Dunn interrupted, is irrelevant. What matters here is strength, tactics, and the will to dominate lesser species. Right, right? Jake nodded sagely, taking a bite of his sandwich. Sounds fair dinkum. Though, just between you and me, mate, you might want to work on that people skills thing. Back home, we'd call that attitude a bit. He searched for the right word. Up yourself. The collective gasp from the assembled cadets was audible across 3 octaves of hearing. Cadet Vraktar's jaw actually unhinged, a physiological response his species reserved for moments of complete shock. Nobody in the recorded history of the Academy had ever told General Moore Dunn he was up yourself. Commander Zeth Cole quickly stepped in before the general could demonstrate exactly why he'd earned the nickname the Bone Grinder. Cadet Thompson, he said, emphasizing the rank to remind everyone present that this creature was, technically, their equal. You will be assigned quarters in Sector 7. Your orientation begins at dawn. I suggest you use the time to prepare yourself for what lies ahead. Jake finished his sandwich and wiped his hands on his uniform, a gesture that caused several nearby cadets to physically recoil in horror. Too right, Commander. Looking forward to it. This is going to be fun. As the human was led away by a visibly uncomfortable escort, the remaining aliens stood in stunned silence. Fun? Had this primitive actually used the word fun to describe enrollment in the most demanding military academy in the galaxy? Cadet Vraktar turned to his companions, his predatory features twisted in confusion. How long do you think it will last before it breaks completely? Click's Andra's crystalline form pulsed with what her species used to indicate certainty. 3 days maximum. The physical training alone will reduce it to a quivering mass of defeated flesh. But as they watched Jake Thompson disappear around a corner, still somehow managing to look like he was on his way to a beach barbecue rather than military boot camp, none of them could shake the feeling that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Something that would, in hindsight, be remembered as the beginning of the end of their comfortable assumptions about the natural order of the universe. After all, primitives were supposed to know their place. The first week of Jake Thompson's academic career at the Krillian Academy could have been described as educational, if one defined education as watching a primitive life form systematically confuse and horrify the galaxy's finest military minds. It began, as most disasters do, with physical training. Dawn on Nexus Prime came with the subtlety of a plasma cannon, and Jake stumbled onto the training field, looking like he'd been assembled from spare parts by a particularly untalented engineer. His hair stuck up at angles that defied both gravity and good sense, and he wore his training gear with the casual indifference of someone who'd clearly never heard of military bearing. Instructor Sergeant Brock Snall, a 10-foot-tall Grimkari whose muscles had muscles, looked down at the human with the expression one might reserve for discovering something unpleasant on the bottom of one's boot. Today, primitive, you will learn why your species remains confined to a single backwater planet, he growled, gesturing toward an obstacle course that resembled a mechanical nightmare designed by sadistic engineers. This is the gauntlet of supremacy. Only the strongest survive. The weak, he smiled, revealing teeth like sharpened titanium. The weak provide entertainment. The course stretched across 2 miles of varied terrain, featuring gravity wells, energy barriers, automated defense turrets, and something called the Pit of Existential Doubt, which was exactly as unpleasant as it sounded. The elite cadets from across the galaxy had been known to emerge from it weeping and questioning their life choices. Jake scratched his head and squinted at the mechanical horror before him. Right then. So I just run through all that, yeah? If you can manage it without dying, Sergeant Broxnell replied. Though I wouldn't bet on your chances. The other cadets had gathered to watch what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. Cadet Vraktar was already taking bets on which obstacle would claim the primitive first. The smart money was on the gravity well, though a few optimists had wagered on the laser grid. Jake shrugged, did a few casual stretches that looked more like he was reaching for something on a high shelf, and jogged toward the course with all the urgency of someone heading to the corner shop for milk. The first obstacle was a wall of pure energy that required precise timing and superhuman reflexes to pass through. Standard procedure called for a running leap at exactly the right microsecond when the field cycled. Jake, apparently unaware of standard procedure, walked straight up to the barrier and started examining it like a curious mechanic. "Interesting," he muttered, pulling out what appeared to be a primitive multi-tool. "Looks like a standard phase cycle pattern, but the frequency's all wonky." He poked at something near the base of the generator. "Probably just needs a good whack." He hit the generator with his tool. The entire energy wall flickered and died. The assembled cadets stared in stunned silence as Jake walked through the now defunct barrier, whistling what sounded like some sort of primitive tribal song. Did he just cadet Clixandra's crystalline form was pulsing with confusion? Did he just sabotage Academy equipment? That's against Regulation 17.4. Squeak to get Plix Zir, a rule-obsessed bureaucration whose species had evolved from filing clerks. Sergeant Broxnell was less concerned with regulations than with the fact that his supposedly impenetrable obstacle course was being casually dismantled by a primitive with what appeared to be a glorified can opener. The second obstacle, a maze of laser grids that required mathematical precision to navigate, met a similar fate when Jake simply crawled under the entire array through a maintenance tunnel that technically wasn't supposed to be accessible to cadets. "That's not how you're supposed to do it," Vraktar shouted. "Says who?" Jake called back, his voice echoing from somewhere inside the tunnel system. "The lasers are up there, I'm down here." "Problem solved, mate." By the time Jake emerged from the course, having somehow completed it in record time while appearing to violate every established military protocol, the assembled cadets were experiencing what their species collectively recognized as cognitive dissonance. But the real horror show began in the academic classes. Professor Keleltharian, the Academy's leading expert on advanced tactical warfare, has spent the better part of 3 centuries developing theoretical frameworks for multidimensional combat scenarios. His classes were legendary for their complexity, often requiring students to calculate probability matrices across 17 different variables while simultaneously planning orbital bombardments. Jake sat in the back row, alternating between looking confused and looking like he was about to fall asleep. "The Nexorian Gambit," Professor Keltharian explained, his tentacles dancing across a holographic display showing fleet positions. It requires precise coordination between 7 battle groups across 4-dimensional planes. The mathematical complexity alone. Jake's hand shot up. "Yes, primitive?" "Sorry, Prof, but why wouldn't you just, go around?" The professor's eye stalks twitched. "Go around?" "Yeah, mate. I mean, if they've got all their defenses facing forward and you've got faster ships, why not just nip around the back and hit their supply lines? Worked pretty well at Gallipoli." "Well, sort of. Different story." "That one." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Cadet Yixthara's breathing apparatus malfunctioning from shock. Because Professor Keltharian said slowly, the Nexorian defense grid extends across 7 light years in all directions. It is mathematically impossible to go around. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Right. But what if you didn't fight them at all?" "I beg your pardon?" "Yes." "Well, if they're spending all that energy on defense grids, their economy must be taking a right hammering. Just wait them out. Set up a blockade, cut off their trade routes, and let them bankrupt themselves. Give it 6 months, they'll be begging to negotiate." Professor Keletharian stared at the human like he'd just suggested using soup spoons as weapons of mass destruction. The concept of not fighting was so alien to galactic military doctrine that it didn't even have a proper translation in most languages. But the worst part, the part that made Cadet Vraktar grind his predatory teeth in frustration, was that Jake's ridiculous ideas kept working. During war game simulations, While other cadets deployed complex strategies involving quantum mechanics and probability calculations, Jake would do something completely mental like send all his forces to attack what appeared to be an unimportant supply depot. Then, 6 hours into the simulation, the enemy's entire battle plan would collapse because they'd run out of ammunition. It doesn't make sense. Vraktar complained to his study group after Jake had somehow defeated a superior force by convincing them they were fighting in the wrong star system entirely. His strategies are random. They have no mathematical basis. Perhaps, suggested Clixandra thoughtfully, that's exactly why they work. It was during one of these increasingly frustrated discussions that Cadet Morthex, a veteran student in his final year, mentioned something that made everyone pay attention. "You know," he said, his scarred carapace gleaming under the common room lights, "there's only one way to settle this properly. The Tournament of Champions is coming up." The tournament. Every cadet knew about it, though few were ever selected to participate. It was the Academy's most prestigious event, where the finest fighters from each year competed for the ultimate honor, facing Warlord Grix Moth in single combat. Grix Moth. Even his name was whispered with reverence and terror. Standing 14 feet tall, with hide like armored plating and strength that could crush a shuttle with his bare hands, he had been the Academy's undefeated champion for 47 years. Students who faced him in the tournament were carried away on medical stretchers. Those were the lucky ones. "They'll never select the primitive," Vraktar scoffed. "He hasn't won a single formal combat exercise." "No," Morthex agreed, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "But he also hasn't lost one either. And the selection committee has been curious about his methods." As if summoned by their conversation, the Academy's announcement system crackled to life. Commander Zeth Cole's voice echoed through the corridors, carrying news that would change everything. "Attention, cadets. The annual Tournament of Champions will commence in one standard week. This year's participants have been selected based on their demonstrated ability to think beyond conventional parameters. The list of names that followed included all the expected champions, Vraktar, Clixandra Morthex, and a handful of other elite cadets whose combat records read like tactical textbooks. And then, at the very end, came the name that made every alien in the Academy question whether the selection committee had suffered some form of collective neural breakdown. Jake Thompson, representing the human contingent. In his quarters, Jake was carefully applying Vegemite to another sandwich, humming tunelessly to himself. He'd heard the announcement, of course, but it hadn't particularly surprised him. After all, he'd come here to learn, and fighting the biggest bloke in the Academy seemed like a pretty educational experience. "Should be fun," he said to nobody in particular, taking a bite of his sandwich. Somewhere in the depths of the Academy, Warlord Grix Moth lifted his massive head and smiled. It had been too long since he'd had a proper opponent. This was going to be interesting. The Grand Colosseum of Nexus Prime had witnessed some spectacular events over the millennia. Planetary champions had bled on its crystalline floors, legendary warriors had carved their names into galactic history within its walls, and at least 3 interstellar wars had been prevented by single combat matches held in its arena. But never in its 3,000-year history had it hosted something quite like this. The tournament bracket hung suspended in midair above the arena, a holographic display that pulsed with the names of the galaxy's finest young warriors. Betting pools had already formed in the spectator sections, with odds calculated to 17 decimal places by professional gamblers from the Quantari banking syndicate. Jake Thompson's name sat at the bottom of the bracket like a typo that nobody had bothered to correct. The odds against him weren't just astronomical, they required new mathematical concepts to properly express. Commander Zeth Cole stood at the podium, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of ceremonial importance. Cadets of the Krillian Academy. His voice boomed across the packed Colosseum, "Today you witness the continuation of our greatest tradition. 8 warriors enter, but only one will earn the honor of facing our undefeated champion." In the VIP section, General Mordun leaned over to his aide. "How much did you wager on the human lasting more than 30 seconds? "Nothing, sir. I'm not completely insane." "Wise choice. The first match pitted Jake against Cadet Throckmar, a Brutellian whose species had evolved from creatures that could punch through solid steel with their bare fists. Throckmar stood 9 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating that had deflected plasma blasts and possessed enough raw strength to bench press a small starship. Jake, by comparison, looked like he'd wandered into the wrong building entirely. He wore the standard combat gear, but somehow managed to make it look casual. While Throckmar performed an elaborate pre-combat ritual involving intimidating roars and chest beating, Jake was examining his fingernails with the detached interest of someone waiting for a bus. Begin. Commander Zeth Cole's voice echoed across the arena. Throckmar charged with the subtlety of an orbital bombardment, his armored fists whistling through the air with enough force to crater concrete. It was a textbook Brutellian assault, overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision, and Jake stepped to the side. Not a tactical roll, not an acrobatic leap, just a casual step, like he was avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. Throckmar's devastating charge carried him straight into the arena wall with an impact that registered on seismic sensors 3 floors down. What just happened? Gasped Cadet Plix Zier, his bureaucratic mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The primitive moved, Raktar replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. But Jake wasn't finished. As Throckmar extracted himself from the wall, shaking his massive head in confusion, Jake walked up behind him and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, mate," he said politely. "You right there?" Throckmar spun around, swinging a haymaker that could have decapitated a Grimkari war beast. Jake ducked under it, stepped forward, and gave the 9-foot alien what appeared to be a friendly pat on the chest. Throckmar collapsed like a demolished building. The silence in the Colosseum was profound enough to constitute a medical emergency for several species whose hearing was adapted for constant background noise. In the VIP section, General Mordun's aide was frantically recalculating odds on his datapad while muttering what sounded like prayers in 6 different languages. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted entities," Commander Zeth Cole announced, his voice carrying a slight tremor, winner by a technical knockout Cadet Thompson. Jake helped Throckmar to his feet with the casual friendliness of someone who'd just won a friendly arm wrestling match rather than a life-or-death combat tournament. "Good on ya, mate. Hell of a charge you've got there. Just need to work on the follow-through." Throckmar, still trying to figure out why his chest felt like it had been hit by a freight train, could only nod in stunned agreement. The second match was scheduled for the following day, giving the Academy's medical staff time to treat Throckmar's mysterious chest injury and the spectators' collective nervous breakdown. The betting pools, meanwhile, had descended into chaos as professional oddsmakers tried to calculate probabilities for tactics that didn't exist in any known military database. Jake's opponent for round 2 was Cadet Zulfira, a shadowkin whose species had perfected the art of interdimensional combat. She could phase in and out of reality at will, strike from angles that didn't technically exist, and had reflexes fast enough to dodge photon beams. The match began with Zulfira immediately vanishing into her species' pocket dimension, a tactic that had never failed to confuse and disorient opponents. The plan was simple: appear behind the primitive, deliver a knockout blow, and collect her advancement to the next round. Jake stood in the center of the arena, hands in his pockets, whistling the same tuneless melody he'd been humming since his arrival. To the spectators, it looked like he was completely unaware of his opponent's location. Then he started talking. "You know, this reminds me of a story my dad used to tell," he said conversationally, apparently addressing thin air. "There was this bloke back home, right? Fancied himself a bit of a hunter. Used to go after crocodiles in the billabongs." In her dimensional phase space, Zulfira paused. This wasn't standard combat behavior. Was the primitive having some sort of mental breakdown? "Thing is," Jake continued, "he spent so much time trying to be clever, creeping around in the shadows and whatnot, that he never noticed the crocs weren't where he thought they were." Jake turned slightly to his left. They were where the food was. He tossed something small and metallic toward the arena wall. Zulfira, still phased, instinctively tracked the movement with her eyes. Jake's fist was waiting when she rematerialized. The impact wasn't devastating like his previous victory, just a solid, well-placed punch that caught her exactly as she shifted back into normal space. Zilphira hit the arena floor with the boneless finality of someone whose dimensional calculations had just been completely invalidated by primitive psychology. Winner, Commander Zeth Cole announced, his voice now carrying a note of genuine bewilderment, Cadet Thompson. In the spectator sections, conversations had shifted from mocking laughter to nervous whispers. Cadet Morthex, whose own match was scheduled for later that day, leaned over to his companions. How did he know where she would appear? Clixandra's crystalline form was pulsing with rapid-fire calculations. He didn't. He made her appear where he wanted her to. That's impossible. Shadowkin dimensional phasing follows quantum probability matrices. You can't just predict. He didn't predict it. Vraktar interrupted, his predatory instincts finally recognizing something his analytical mind had missed. He manipulated it. The metal object he threw? She tracked it. He used her own reflexes against her. The implications of this statement hit the group like a tactical revelation. The primitive wasn't winning through superior strength or advanced technology. He was winning by understanding his opponents better than they understood themselves. This realization spread through the spectator sections like a virus, carried by whispered conversations and nervous glances. By the time Jake faced his third opponent, Cadet Brix Toll, a master of 17 different martial arts forms, the betting pools had closed entirely. The professional gamblers had declared the human incalculable and refused to take any more wagers. Brix Toll's defeat was perhaps the most educational of all. The 8-armed Kefarian had trained since childhood in combat techniques that spanned multiple star systems. His fighting style was a beautiful symphony of calculated violence, each movement flowing into the next with mathematical precision. Jake beat him by doing absolutely nothing. For the first 3 minutes of the match, Jake simply stood there, hands at his sides, watching Brix Toll's elaborate combat display with the polite attention of someone enjoying a cultural performance. He didn't attack, didn't defend, didn't even move except to occasionally shift his weight from one foot to the other. Brix Toll, increasingly frustrated by his opponent's lack of response, began incorporating more and more complex techniques, pushing himself to demonstrate every skill in his considerable arsenal. By the 5-minute mark, he was breathing heavily. By 7 minutes, his perfect form was beginning to show strain. At precisely 8 minutes and 37 seconds, Jake stepped forward and gently pushed Brix Toll on the shoulder. The exhausted Kefarian toppled over like a tree. "I don't understand," General Mordun muttered to his aide as medical teams carried another defeated opponent from the arena. "What kind of combat doctrine is this?" His aide, who had been frantically consulting military databases all afternoon, looked up from his datapad with an expression of complete defeat. "Sir, I don't think it is a doctrine. I think it's just him." As Jake advanced to the tournament finals, scheduled for the following day against the winner of the other bracket, one thing had become absolutely clear to every alien in the Krillian Academy. They had no idea what they were dealing with. And tomorrow, Jake Thompson would face Warlord Grix Moth, the undefeated champion who had never lost a single combat in 47 years of competition. The really terrifying part was that Jake still looked like he was having fun. Championship day at the Krillian Academy arrived with all the pomp and circumstance usually reserved for planetary coronations or the declaration of interstellar wars. The Grand Colosseum had been packed beyond capacity, with beings from 17 different star systems cramming into every available space to witness what was already being called the most improbable sporting event in Galactic bet history. The betting pools, after 3 days of complete chaos, had finally settled on a single, universally agreed-upon position. Nobody had the faintest idea what was going to happen. Jake Thompson sat in the competitor's preparation chamber, methodically eating what appeared to be his breakfast. The fact that he was consuming Vegemite sandwiches 20 minutes before facing the most dangerous warrior in known space struck the medical staff as either supreme confidence or a complete psychological break from reality. "You know, mate," Jake said to the hovering medical drone that was monitoring his vital signs. Back home, we've got this saying, "She'll be right." Means everything will work out fine in the end. The medical drone, programmed to provide psychological support to competitors, processed this statement for several seconds before responding in its most soothing electronic voice. "Your optimism is noted, though statistically improbable given current circumstances." "Yeah, well," Jake grinned, finishing his sandwich, "statistics never met my Uncle Bruce." Meanwhile, in the champion's quarters on the opposite side of the arena complex, Warlord Grix Moth was completing his pre-combat meditation. Standing 12 feet tall and weighing close to 800 pounds of pure muscle and bone, he was what evolution looked like when it decided to optimize purely for violence. His species, the Devastators, had conquered 14 star systems before joining galactic civilization. Their home planet had no word for surrender, and their traditional greeting translated roughly as "I acknowledge your worthiness to die by my hand." Grix Moth, even by Devastator standards, was considered excessive. His combat record was the stuff of legend: 47 years undefeated, 312 opponents, 0 losses. The mathematical probability of achieving such a record through luck alone was so small it required scientific notation to express properly. He had studied the footage of the human's previous matches, of course. As champion, it was his duty to understand every opponent, no matter how apparently insignificant. What he had seen had intrigued him in ways he didn't fully understand. The primitive fought like no warrior he had ever encountered. There was no formal training, no adherence to established combat doctrine, no respect for the mathematical principles that governed all proper warfare. Instead, there was something else. Something that his warrior's instincts recognized but his analytical mind couldn't categorize. It was unpredictability made manifest. The arena announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum, a sound that could be heard on 3 different continents. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted entities, presenting your reigning champion, undefeated in 47 years of competition, the devastator of worlds, the crusher of dreams, the one and only Warlord Grix Moth." The crowd's roar was deafening as the massive warrior emerged from the tunnel, his footsteps causing minor seismic tremors that registered on monitoring equipment 6 floors below. He wore no armor, carried no weapons, because when you were Grix Moth, your body was weapon enough. And his challenger, the announcer continued, though his voice carried a note of barely suppressed incredulity, representing the human contingent, Jake "Crocodile" Thompson. The human emerged from the opposite tunnel with the casual demeanor of someone arriving late to a barbecue. He waved at the crowd like they were old friends, apparently oblivious to the fact that most of them were taking bets on which piece of him would hit the arena wall first. Commander Zethkol stood at the arena's edge, holding the ceremonial combat staff that would signal the beginning of the match. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never felt quite this level of morbid curiosity about the outcome of a single fight. "Combatants," he called out, his voice carrying across the arena, "you know the rules. Victory by surrender, incapacitation," or he paused, glancing at the human. "Death. Are you ready?" Grix Moth nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect for the ritual and absolute certainty of victory. Jake scratched his head and shrugged. "Yeah, righto. Let's have a go then. Begin." What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come, though scholars would never quite agree on how to classify it tactically. Grix Moth moved with the terrible grace of a natural disaster. His opening assault was a masterpiece of applied physics, a charging attack that combined 800 pounds of mass with acceleration that shouldn't have been possible for something his size. The arena floor cracked under his footsteps. Jake Thompson ran away. Not a tactical retreat, not a strategic repositioning, but an actual, honest-to-goodness sprint in the opposite direction that looked for all the world like pure panic. He ran in a wide circle around the arena's perimeter, occasionally glancing over his shoulder like a tourist being chased by an angry local wildlife. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unanimous, confused disappointment mixed with embarrassed sympathy. Several spectators actually covered their visual organs, unable to watch what they assumed would be a massacre the moment Grixmoth caught up with his fleeing opponent. But Grixmoth, veteran of thousands of battles, noticed something that the spectators missed. The human's panicked flight wasn't random. He was maintaining a precise distance, staying just out of reach while moving in a pattern that forced the Devastator to constantly adjust his pursuit angle. More importantly, Jake was talking. "Bloody hell, you're a big one, aren't you?" He called over his shoulder, his voice carrying clearly across the arena. "Fast, too. Must be all that muscle. Bet you could bench press a starship." Grixmoth said nothing, focusing on closing the distance between them. But Jake's casual commentary continued. "You know, you remind me of this bull we had back home. Massive thing, all muscle and attitude. Used to charge at anything that moved. Course, the thing about bulls is, they're not real good at stopping once they get going." For exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds, this chase continued. Jake running, Grixmoth pursuing, the crowd growing increasingly restless as they watched what appeared to be the least heroic performance in tournament history. Then Jake stopped running. He didn't slow down gradually or signal his intention. One moment he was in full flight, the next he had planted his feet and turned to face the charging Devastator. Grixmoth, committed to his pursuit at full speed, found himself bearing down on a suddenly stationary target with all the momentum of a small asteroid. What Jake did next violated several laws of physics, most principles of combat engineering, and at least 3 interstellar treaties regarding the humane treatment of prisoners. He suplexed a 12-foot-tall alien warrior. The technique itself was mathematically impossible. Jake stood barely 6 feet tall and weighed perhaps 1/4 of his opponent's mass. By every calculation known to galactic science, he should have been crushed like an insect the moment he attempted to grapple with Grixmoth. Instead, he used the Devastator's own momentum against him, redirecting 800 pounds of charging alien into a perfect arc that ended with Grixmoth's head meeting the arena floor with a sound like a small moon cracking. The impact registered 8.7 on the seismic scale. The silence that followed was so complete that several species began checking their hearing organs for damage. In the VIP section, General Moore Dunn's mouth was hanging open wide enough to park a shuttle in it. Commander Zeth Cole stood frozen at the arena's edge, the ceremonial staff forgotten in his suddenly nerveless grip. Jake dusted off his hands and looked down at the motionless form of the galaxy's most feared warrior. Grixmoth was breathing, which was more than most of his previous opponents could claim after facing him, but he was decidedly unconscious and showed no signs of changing that status anytime soon. "Winner," Commander Zeth Cole announced, his voice barely above a whisper, by knockout cadet Jake Thompson. The crowd's reaction came in waves. First shock, then confusion, then a growing murmur of disbelief that slowly built into something approaching hysteria. Beings from across the galaxy were frantically trying to recalculate everything they thought they knew about physics, combat theory, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Jake walked over to where Grixmoth lay and gently checked his pulse, nodding with satisfaction when he found it strong and steady. Then he looked up at the crowd, many of whom were still staring at him like he'd just performed actual magic. "Good match," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Hell of a fighter, that one. Really got the blood pumping." He paused, seeming to consider the magnitude of what had just occurred, defeating the undefeated champion, rewriting the tactical assumptions of an entire galactic civilization, and fundamentally altering the balance of military power in known space. Jake shrugged. Just another Tuesday, really. The medical teams finally remembered how to move and rushed onto the arena floor to attend to Grixmoth, who was beginning to show signs of regaining consciousness. Jake helped them load the massive warrior onto a medical transport, offering helpful suggestions about proper spine alignment and the importance of checking for concussion symptoms. As the crowd slowly began to process what they had witnessed, one fact became inescapably clear to every alien in the Krillian Academy. The humans had just announced their arrival on the galactic stage in the most dramatic way possible, and Jake Thompson was already thinking about what to have for lunch. The emergency faculty meeting that convened 3 hours after Jake's impossible victory resembled less a military briefing and more a theological crisis. Professors, instructors, and senior staff from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence around the Academy's grand conference table, each trying to process what they had witnessed and failing spectacularly. General Mordun, his scarred features bearing an expression of profound bewilderment, spoke first. In 400 years of military service, I have never seen anything like that. The primitive defeated our champion using techniques that don't exist in any database. That's just it, Professor Kilatharian interjected, his tentacles writhing with agitation. They weren't techniques at all. There was no formal training, no established doctrine, no mathematical framework. It was pure improvisation. Commander Zeth Cole leaned back in his chair, forearms spread in a gesture of defeat. We've been approaching this all wrong. We assumed the human was primitive because his methods didn't match our understanding of advanced warfare. But what if our understanding is the limitation? The question hung in the air like a tactical revelation waiting to explode. Jake himself, meanwhile, was in the Academy's medical bay, not as a patient but as a visitor. He sat beside Grix Moth's recovery bed, sharing what appeared to be another Vegemite sandwich with the slowly recovering Devastator. "Feeling better, mate?" Jake asked as Grix Moth's massive eyes fluttered open. The former champion's voice was a rumbling whisper. "How did you know? My charging pattern is mathematically unpredictable." Jake grinned and took a bite of his sandwich. "See, that's where you've got it backwards. You were thinking like a warrior, all precise and calculated. But back home, we don't fight warriors much. We fight crocodiles, spiders the size of dinner plates, and drop bears that'll rip your face off just for looking at them funny." Grix Moth's confusion was evident even through his species' naturally intimidating features. "Thing is," Jake continued, "nature doesn't follow military doctrine. A croc doesn't charge at you because it's tactically sound. It charges because that's what crocs do. So you don't counter the technique, you counter the instinct." "Instinct," Grix Moth repeated slowly, as if the word were foreign to him. "Right. You're a fighter, probably been trained since you could walk. When something runs from you, every instinct says chase it down. So I ran, you chased, and when you were committed to the chase, Jake made a gesture that somehow conveyed the entire Suplex in miniature. Physics did the rest." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Academy's entire senior staff, who filed into the medical bay with the nervous energy of beings approaching something they didn't quite understand. Commander Zeth Cole stepped forward, his usual military bearing replaced by something approaching respectful curiosity. "Cadet Thompson, we need to understand. Your fighting style, your tactical approach, he searched for the right words. Your complete disregard for established military principles. How do we classify this?" Jake scratched his head thoughtfully. "Well, back home we'd probably call it winging it, but I suppose that doesn't sound very official." "Winging it?" General Mordun's voice carried a note of horror. "Yeah, you know, making it up as you go along, adapting to whatever comes up. We're pretty good at that, US humans. Had to be, really. Our planet's been trying to kill us since day one, so we learned to roll with the punches." Professor Kilatharian leaned forward intently. "You mean your entire species operates without predetermined tactical frameworks?" "Not exactly," Jake replied. "We've got plenty of strategies and doctrines and all that. But when things go sideways, and they always do, we just figure something out. Controlled chaos, my old drill sergeant used to call it." The aliens exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations. Controlled chaos. The concept was so alien to their ordered, mathematical approach to warfare that it might as well have been magic. Commander Zeth Cole cleared his throat officially. "Cadet Thompson, on behalf of the Krillian Academy, I hereby grant you full graduation honors. Your unconventional methods have proven educational." He paused, then added with visible effort, "We would also like to extend an invitation for additional human exchange students. It seems we have much to learn from your species' approach to military science." Jake's grin could have powered a small starship. Too right. I'll put in a good word when I get home. Though I should probably warn you, his expression grew thoughtful, almost mischievous. I'm probably the most conventional bloke they'll send. The really interesting ones are still back on Earth. The silence that followed this statement was profound enough to register on atmospheric sensors. More conventional? General Moore Dunn's voice was barely a whisper. Oh yeah, Jake nodded cheerfully. Wait until you meet the Special Forces lads, or the Aussie rules players. Or my Nan, for that matter. She once fought off 3 dingoes with nothing but a rolling pin and some very colorful language. As Jake packed his belongings and prepared to return to Earth, word of his victory was already spreading across the galaxy. Military academies on 17 different worlds were requesting copies of the combat footage. Strategic analysts were developing entirely new theoretical frameworks based on something called human unpredictability doctrine. The Krillian Academy's reputation as the galaxy's premier military institution remained intact, but it now came with an addendum that would be studied for generations. Sometimes the most advanced strategy was no strategy at all. Jake's final words to his alien classmates, delivered with his characteristic grin as he boarded the transport that would take him home, became legendary throughout galactic military circles. Thanks for the education, mates. But fair warning, he winked at the assembled crowd of beings who had come to see him off. You haven't seen anything yet. The transport disappeared into hyperspace, carrying with it the human who had casually rewritten the fundamental assumptions of galactic warfare. Back on Nexus Prime, the faculty was already drafting new curriculum requirements. After all, if humans could suplex reality itself, perhaps it was time to learn how.